Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still remember that day in 1998, like it was yesterday, even though the details feel like they belong in someone else's nightmare. Back then, I was stationed near Anchorage, Alaska, serving as a Navy SEAL. Early that morning, I was sipping a barely warm cup of coffee in our break room, thinking it would be just another routine day. But then Commander Sullivan stepped in, looking more tense than I'd ever seen her. She told me about some suspicious reports coming from an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Nothing too specific, just strange sounds, a few sightings of something big moving around after dark. Normally, such calls didn't faze me. I'd seen more than my fair share of weird situations. But for some reason, her urgency set me on edge. We left not long after she gave the orders. Our convoy rumbled along the icy roads, leading toward this old metal building that sat in a half-dead industrial lot. The air was thick with a cold dampness that soaked right through my jacket. Even before we pulled up, I could sense something off about that place. I don't know if it was the overcast Alaskan sky or the eerie silence, but it felt like a tomb. The warehouse itself was massive and rusted out, like it had been sitting there for decades, forgotten by the rest of the world. Huge metal walls, corroded beams, shattered windows, just an absolute eyesore against the snowy backdrop. I remember glancing at my teammate who was driving. Neither of us said anything, but our looks spoke volumes. It was the kind of place you'd see in some urban legend or hear about in a rumor from local hunters. Once we stopped, Commander Sullivan told me I was going inside with a small team to see if we could figure out what was actually going on. The rest would fan out around the perimeter. Everything about this felt standard. Check the interior, assess any threats, then regroup. But there was a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I shouldered my gear, flicked on my flashlight, and led the small crew inside. The moment we stepped in, the darkness swallowed us whole. Our beams of light barely cut through the gloom, revealing piles of twisted metal, broken crates, and debris all over the floor. The place smelled like stale air and rotting wood. Each step I took crunched against something, and the echo just kept bouncing back and forth until it faded into a heavy silence. As we split up to cover more ground, I felt this strange chill sweep over me, and it wasn't just from the Alaskan cold. While scanning the area, I heard a faint scraping noise, like metal on concrete. At first, I thought maybe one of the other guys was moving something, but when I radioed them, they were all at different corners and hadn't touched a thing. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, and it seemed to circle around in the darkness. My heart started pounding, and I gave the signal to be on high alert. But in a place that dark and cluttered, we might as well have been blind. I moved deeper into the warehouse, stepping over torn-up panels and twisted wires. My flashlight picked up marks on the ground, long scratches that looked like they'd been carved by something with serious strength. Not bullet holes, not normal wear and tear. They were deep gouges into the concrete floor, almost like claw marks. My mind struggled to piece together any logical explanation. Animals that big and aggressive don't just wander into a sealed-off building, at least not in my experience. The deeper I went, the more disoriented I felt. It was as though the walls were closing in, despite the place being huge. I kept seeing small flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned, it was just more shadows on rusted metal. Then that scraping sound returned, closer this time. I nearly dropped my flashlight when a sudden crash reverberated through the building. One of my teammates, Santiago, reported over the radio that he found a collapsed shelving unit. He'd accidentally nudged it, causing a big racket. My adrenaline was so high, I almost laughed out loud from the release of tension. But then the scraping started again, and I realized it wasn't Santiago. I was about to respond to the radio when I heard what sounded like a heavy footstep echo from behind one of the larger stacks of junk. I froze, carefully shining my flashlight in that direction. The beam fell on a twisted piece of sheet metal that looked like it had been bent in half. I crept around it, only to see more deep scratches leading away into another dark corner. That was enough for me. I called the rest of my small team to regroup near the entrance so we could exit and coordinate outside. My gut told me we should handle this with a clearer plan. Outside, the others had been sweeping the perimeter. They hadn't found any people or vehicles, but they did spot a curious set of footprints around the back entrance, much larger than an average boot size, with some weird pattern at the front, like extended toe marks. They almost looked like massive clawed imprints. By then, we were all on edge, feeling like we'd stumbled into something that wasn't supposed to exist. Commander Sullivan ordered us to keep the area secure while we waited for a second wave of reinforcement to check the outside in broader daylight. A few hours later, more guys showed up with dogs and better floodlights. We did a second sweep of the grounds, and that's when we discovered more tracks leading away from the warehouse toward a nearby patch of forest. The impression we got was that something large had moved between the warehouse and that tree line multiple times. The sun was setting faster than we liked. In the Alaskan winter, daylight can feel shockingly brief. By the time we followed the tracks a short distance into the woods, it was already getting dark. Normally I'm comfortable in the wild. SEAL training in harsh conditions is second nature to me. But that night, the forest felt suffocating. Every step we took crunched the snow, echoing in the quiet, and we kept expecting something to jump out at us. Suddenly, a shrill noise cut through the air. It wasn't an animal call I recognized, and it didn't sound mechanical either. It was almost like twisted metal screaming, but it came from somewhere behind the trees. I felt my blood run cold, and my breath caught in my throat. Several of us tried to radio back to the warehouse, but our signals were coming in and out. Anchorage might be a developed place, but we were far enough from the city, in this thick patch of woods, that communication got dicey. A sense of dread washed over me. I think the others felt it too. We were in a situation we didn't understand, against something we couldn't see clearly. The next logical step was to regroup at the warehouse. At least there we could have walls around us, maybe set up some lights and wait for more backup. As we trekked back, that same screeching noise echoed again, followed by what sounded like trees snapping. We found a small path of broken branches, as if something huge had pushed right through. Back inside the warehouse, we set up a makeshift command point near the entrance. The air felt heavier than before, like whatever was out there had somehow seeped into the building's atmosphere. We couldn't just write this off as a bear or a wolf. Nothing about those footprints matched anything we'd seen in the Alaskan wild, and the marks on the concrete floor were simply unexplainable. Commander Sullivan made calls to the local authorities, and eventually a team from the state showed up to secure the perimeter. The moment they arrived, it was like our tension broke, and we let out a collective sigh of relief. At least we weren't alone. But even the new guys looked spooked when they saw those footprints and the damaged areas inside. The lack of any normal explanation put everyone on edge. We spent a few more hours combing through the building and surrounding land with the help of the new arrivals. But the more we searched, the more it felt like we were chasing ghosts. No creature, no person, no real evidence, just shredded metal, weird tracks, and that overwhelming feeling that something was watching us. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything went quiet. The screeching stopped. No more scraping noises. The night just settled into this strange stillness. We stayed on alert, waiting for any sign of movement, but nothing came. Eventually, Commander Sullivan decided we'd done everything we could. The place was documented. Samples of footprints were taken, photos of the scratches collected. But there were no answers, not that night, or in the days that followed. Even now, all these years later, I can't explain what happened in that warehouse or what lurked in those woods. I've been in combat. I've experienced firefights and stealth missions in hostile territory. But the fear I felt that day was something different, like facing an unknown force you can't strategize against because you have no idea what it is. I've heard the local rumors. Some folks whisper about genetic experiments or cryptids, while others claim it was just a bear. But in my gut, I know it wasn't that simple. We never found any conclusive proof, and everything died down as quickly as it started. It still gives me chills to think about those giant claw marks and the eerie noises I heard echoing in that pitch-black building. I've seen a lot in my career, but to this day, nothing matches the sense of raw dread I felt walking those corridors, flashlight shaking in my hands, listening to that scraping in the dark. I honestly don't know what I encountered that night in Anchorage, and maybe it's better that way. The whole thing just ended. No finale, no final fight. Just this unresolved terror that lingered in the back of my mind, reminding me that not everything on this earth can be neatly explained. Story 2. I still remember how humid the air felt that morning back in 2002, in Crescent City. I was 38, serving as a SEAL, and I honestly believed this mission would be a breeze, just some routine check into weird rumors about suspicious activity in the forest. Crescent City never struck me as the kind of place where danger lurked. It was mostly known for its calm vibe and beautiful coastal scenery. But something was off that day from the start, and I felt it the moment we stepped off the truck. I headed into the woods with a small team, all of us used to tough terrains and tense situations. But this forest, it felt different. Almost immediately I noticed how dark it was, even though it wasn't that late in the morning. The canopy was so thick, barely letting any sunlight through, and the air felt so dense that every breath seemed heavier than the last. I've been in plenty of forest before, steaming jungles overseas, places that tested your endurance. But this was a whole different kind of oppressive. We started seeing signs of something unusual pretty fast. Broken branches, pathways trampled in irregular patterns. I remember running my hand along a tree trunk and seeing these deep scratches. They weren't random claw marks from a bear or some other large animal I recognized. They had a strange angle, like whatever made them had long reach and more force than I expected. One of my teammates noticed footprints that seemed partially human but dragged in a way that made no sense. We moved deeper, scanning every few seconds. I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched, even though I couldn't see anything but thick foliage and heavy shadows. We came upon what looked like an improvised campsite, some old tarps, a half-burned log, scraps of something that might have been clothing. The sight was unnerving because it felt recent, like whoever was there had just abandoned it in a hurry. We found no personal items, no backpack, nothing that gave a clue as to who or what was out here. The strangest part was how the air around that site felt charged, like static electricity right before a storm. Our radios weren't working well. The forest was messing with the signals, and every time I tried to check in, the static was unbearable. We had to stick to hand signals and remain close enough to keep visual contact. That made the tension even thicker because we're trained to rely on comms in these situations, and losing that lifeline puts you on edge. At one point, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a flicker in the trees, gone in a second. I silently signaled for the others to spread out, each person covering a different angle, but staying in sight. My pulse was hammering, not from fear in the normal sense, but from this growing certainty that something was tracking us. I couldn't identify it. Was it a person? An animal? My gut told me it might be neither. Later in the afternoon, we came across a narrow clearing that seemed unnaturally silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. On the ground, we found pieces of torn fabric snagged on branches, some fresh enough that the threads still looked vibrant. The shapes in the dirt there felt uneasy, like multiple sets of tracks had overlapped, and you couldn't tell where one set ended and the other began. It reminded me of a frantic struggle, but without any sign of who had been involved or why. As nightfall crept in, the place took on a whole new level of dread. Darkness moved fast under that canopy, and without clear radio contact or a safe route back, we decided to set up a makeshift observation post. We climbed into the lower branches of these thick, tall trees. It wasn't comfortable, but it gave us a partial view of the clearing. The plan was simple: watch, stay quiet, and see if whatever was roaming out there came back. That night felt longer than any I've experienced. I've done stakeouts that lasted days, but nothing compares to the tension of that single evening. I could barely make out the silhouettes of my teammates in their trees. The forest itself started making sounds that I couldn't recognize, like knocks, but softer, coming in patterns, almost as if someone or something was communicating in code out there in the dark. Around midnight, I nearly lost my grip on the branch when a massive shape moved through the clearing. I say massive because it was tall enough to block out what little moonlight there was, but it was silent. No heavy footsteps, no crunching of leaves. It just glided across. My entire body went numb with a feeling I can't quite put into words. I've faced armed opponents, endured extreme training, seen horrifying stuff overseas, but this was primal fear, something I'd never felt before. I looked toward one of my teammates. Even in the dark, I could sense he saw it too. We stayed still, hearts pounding so loud I was afraid that alone might give us away. The shape didn't linger. It passed through and vanished among the trees like it was never there. For a few agonizing minutes we waited, expecting it to circle back. All that came was silence, thicker than the darkness itself. When dawn finally broke, the forest looked almost normal again, like it had hidden all its secrets with the passing of the night. We climbed down, scanning the ground for footprints or any sign of whatever we saw, but the leaves and soil seemed untouched. It was baffling. No fresh prints, no disturbed bushes, just us, standing there in the early morning haze, feeling like we'd lost a chunk of reality. We regrouped, trying once more to make sense of it all. The broken branches, the torn fabric, those bizarre scratch marks on the trees, and that looming figure that moved without a sound. It felt like we'd dipped into some nightmare. But there we were, awake, gear in hand, daylight on our faces. I still get chills thinking about it. We reported everything we observed, but without concrete evidence, photos, physical samples. Most of the official reaction was that we probably stumbled on some illegal squatter's camp, or maybe a bear with a strange gait. But I know what I felt, and my teammates did too. We don't spook that easily, and we all had the same unsettled expression for weeks afterward. Ever since that day, Crescent City's forests never looked the same to me. I've gone on other missions, faced actual firefights, but nothing shook me like that single night under those suffocating trees. It's the kind of memory that comes back in dreams, leaving me sweating and wide awake, unable to shake the feeling that something out there watched us and let us leave. Even now, I can't give a neat explanation for what happened. No one else really can. Maybe it was an animal unknown to us, maybe a person in some advanced camouflage suit, or maybe something that defies all logic. All I know is that it changed my understanding of what might lurk in the shadows when you least expect it. I'm sharing this because the memory never stopped haunting me. It was supposed to be a basic assignment, something I'd forget by the end of the week. Instead, it's one of those moments that just stays with you, popping up in the back of your head every time you walk into a dark place alone. And though it all seemed to end as abruptly as it started, no final confrontation, no easy answers, I've never been able to dismiss the unsettling sense that we crossed paths with something beyond normal human experience that night. And it still sends chills through me, even all these years later. Story 3. I still remember that night in 2005 like it just happened yesterday. I was freshly back in San Diego after a long deployment, tired, excited, and glad to be home. My buddy Jake, also a SEAL, insisted we head out to a local bar to celebrate my return. It seemed like a low-key night at first, just a couple of beers, some laughter, and the relief of not being stuck on a ship anymore. Then we noticed this woman in a corner booth who looked completely shaken. Her eyes were wide, like she'd seen something she couldn't process. She was trembling, clutching a half-finished drink, trying to tell people around her about an incident in some secret facility outside the city. Most folks were politely ignoring her, but there was something about her fear that made us pay attention. Jake and I have seen our share of scary stuff, so it takes a lot to rattle us. But she looked genuinely terrified. We approached her gently, and she clung to our arms as if we were her last hope. She kept talking about an attack, a creature, some kind of monstrous thing that had caused chaos in a place she called the installation. She was rambling so much it was hard to get details, but she said it was hidden somewhere in the hills around San Diego. Jake and I exchanged a look. We both felt a weird buzz of adrenaline. Normally we wouldn't jump on a random story, but something about her felt real. She begged us not to go if we valued our lives, but it was almost like she also wanted help, like she couldn't stand the thought of no one believing her. She gave us enough information to figure out a possible location. We left her at the bar to recover, and we grabbed my car. We drove under a cloudy night sky, guided by half-remembered directions she'd given us, plus our best guess of where a secret facility might be tucked away. The roads got narrower as we went deeper into the hills, and there was hardly any traffic. It was one of those drives where you start second-guessing every turn, wondering if you're chasing a ghost story. When we finally reached what we thought was the spot, the building looked almost too normal, like a big warehouse or research center with minimal signage. No lights shone from the windows, though, and the front gate stood open, hanging crooked on its hinges. Right away, we picked up on something being off. We're trained to notice details, and that open gate screamed, "Forced entry." We parked a short distance away and approached carefully side by side, as we'd done so many times before. Inside, the corridors were mostly dark, lit only by a few flickering emergency lights. Everything was unnervingly quiet. We saw shattered glass from overhead lights, and the walls had gouges like someone, or something, had torn through them. Each step we took felt heavier, like our bodies were telling us to turn around. But we pressed on, scanning every corner with our flashlights. We passed rooms that looked like offices, desks flipped over, paperwork scattered, monitors smashed. At first, I thought maybe it was some break-in or sabotage, but it was the emptiness that got to me. Not a single soul anywhere, not even a guard at the front. We saw security cameras ripped off the walls, cables dangling. That's not common vandalism. It looked more like something powerful had swatted them aside. Further in, we started noticing these weird claw-like marks on the floor. They were deep and spaced in a way I've never seen before. They didn't match any animal tracks I recognized. I knelt down to touch the grooves and felt how sharply cut they were in the concrete. My gut twisted. It felt all wrong. I could see Jake's jaw tighten. We're used to dealing with threats, but we both knew we might be up against something well beyond a typical intruder. We tried to use our radios to call for some backup from local authorities or anyone who might listen, but the signal was spotty. I could hear static, maybe some faint voices, but it was useless. That's when we heard a muffled, guttural roar coming from somewhere deep in the facility. My heart skipped a beat. Jake and I instinctively raised our weapons. I'll never forget that feeling of raw dread washing over me. It wasn't just fear. It was the sense that we'd just stepped into a place we weren't supposed to be. We heard heavy footsteps echo down the corridors, like they were made by something huge. They came and went, disappearing into the distance, but they kept getting closer again, circling us. We tried to stay calm, focusing on our training. We know how to handle dangerous opponents, but it was hard to shake the image of those claw marks and that roar. At one point, we turned a corner and found a large lab with thick glass windows. Inside, everything was in disarray, racks of samples knocked over, computers smashed on the floor. We saw folders labeled with bizarre experiment codes, talk of genetic manipulation and accelerated growth. Pages of scientific jargon were scattered all over. My mind was racing, trying to piece together a reason for the destruction. Then that roaring came again, closer. The ground seemed to vibrate under my boots. We needed cover, so we slipped into a partially intact lab down the hall, barricading the door with heavy tables. The smell in there was a mix of disinfectant and something metallic, like old blood. I tried not to think about it too hard. While Jake tried again to get a signal on the radio, I thumbed through some of the documents on a nearby desk. Most of it was over my head scientifically, but I caught words like enhanced aggression, rapid mutational state, and contingency. It felt like something out of a horror movie, but I knew it was real. This was the same place the woman at the bar had warned us about. Our plan was to stay quiet and wait for our call for help to go through. Every so often we heard that low, throaty growl or scraping against the walls outside. My nerves were on edge. I gripped my sidearm so tight my hand started to cramp. I remember the flickering overhead light in that lab, how it made everything feel even more surreal. We're used to high-pressure situations, but this was different. We didn't know what was out there, just that it was violent enough to rip through reinforced doors. Eventually, we caught a break. Our radio crackled to life, and we managed to send out a garbled distress signal. It must have gotten through because not too long after, we heard distant explosions and saw flashes of light coming through the cracked windows in the hallway. We guessed it was some kind of response team. The facility's alarm system kicked in too, bathing the corridors in red strobe lights. Through the blaring noise, we heard men shouting orders, telling anyone inside to identify themselves. We decided to move out of the lab slowly. We pushed aside our makeshift barricade, hearts pounding, and peered into the corridor. Sure enough, we found a group of special ops guys, maybe local or federal, I'm still not sure. They were sweeping the area, guns raised, scanning every inch. They signaled for us to come forward, and we did, carefully. I'll never forget the look in one of the team leaders' eyes. He seemed as tense and spooked as we were. According to them, something had been neutralized. They referred to it as a hostile entity, but the way they spoke told me they didn't even know what they'd just contained. Apparently, it took a serious amount of firepower to bring it down. I saw a couple of them carrying tranquilizer guns, too, which struck me as odd. When we asked for more info, they just told us to keep our distance. I caught sight of a twisted metal door near the end of the hallway and what looked like huge, bloody tracks leading toward a service elevator. A few guys in hazmat suits were rushing in that direction. It didn't look like any standard military operation I've been part of. Jake and I exchanged one last glance. We both realized we'd stepped into something far larger than we'd ever expected. 1 minute, we're sipping beers at a bar. The next, we're caught in a government-level cleanup of a possible genetic experiment gone horribly wrong. It was too much to take in, but we had no choice except to clear the area as requested. They escorted us out of the building and told us to keep quiet, probably suspecting we'd never be able to prove what we saw anyway. We made our way back to the car, under the swirling red and blue lights of official vehicles. I remember my legs feeling like jelly. Even though I'm trained for combat, there was something unreal about that whole experience, like my mind was refusing to process what could have been an actual living nightmare. Over the years, I've tried to make sense of it. The more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that place was some covert operation messing with science no one should touch. Whatever they created was powerful enough to tear through reinforced doors and vanish entire teams of researchers. The woman at the bar must have been an employee or a witness. She probably saw things that nobody would believe unless they saw them for themselves. After that night, I never heard any official statements about the incident. The facility apparently went back to business, or maybe got shut down. I honestly don't know. Jake and I tried asking around, but we got a bunch of dead ends and a few warnings to mind our own business. It felt like we were hitting a wall of secrecy that was bigger than any of us. In the end, we both had to let it go and move on. But I still have nightmares sometimes. I see those claw marks in the concrete and relive that roar echoing in those dark corridors. It's something that doesn't quite fit into the normal categories of enemy combatant or wild animal. And every once in a while, I think back to the expression on that woman's face in the bar, pure terror, like she'd glimpsed the ugly side of something no one should ever see. It's hard to talk about this even now, because I still don't have answers. Everything about that night just ended so abruptly. After the special teams swept in, it was like we were cut out of the loop. One moment we were facing down something unimaginable, and the next we were told to keep our mouths shut and forget it ever happened. But I can't forget. I never will. And if sharing this helps someone understand that not everything is as simple as it seems, well, that's enough for me. Sometimes the scariest things are the ones we aren't meant to discover, and honestly, I still wish I never had. Story 4. I still remember the exact feeling in my gut that day, like something was off from the moment we stepped out of the vehicle in that deserted corner of Detroit. It was 2007, and I was in the middle of a classified operation, working alongside my teammate Marcus Weston. We were both SEAL veterans, used to high-pressure situations, but that place felt different. The air tasted stale, and every single noise seemed magnified in my head, even though it was practically silent. Our target was an old industrial zone, completely abandoned. The city had been struggling for a while, but this specific site felt like it had been left behind decades ago. The mission was simple on paper: investigate some bizarre reports that local authorities couldn't make sense of. We didn't have many details, just that people had heard strange noises and claimed there was some activity in the old warehouses. In any other scenario, I'd chalk it up to squatters or maybe some illegal operations. But as soon as Marcus and I stepped inside, I could tell we were dealing with something else. The first thing I noticed was how dark it was. There was no electricity at all, and the entire building seemed hollowed out. I remember wiping my flashlight across the corridor and seeing beams of dust floating in the air. It smelled like old metal, rust, and something else I couldn't identify, like wet stones maybe. We were used to nasty conditions, but there was something oppressive here that made my heart pound a little harder. As we moved deeper, it felt even more unsettling. The place was dead silent, not even rats scuttling around. It was just me, Marcus, and the echo of our own footsteps. I could sense Marcus was uneasy too. I could feel his tension. We kept moving, because that's what you do. You push forward regardless of the fear in your gut. Eventually, we found a large metal door, slightly ajar, in one of the corridors. It looked out of place, like somebody had forced it open, or maybe it had just rusted in a half-open position over time. Inside, was a complete mess. Piles of old documents scattered across the floor, dented metal cabinets, and these weird scratch marks on the walls. They were too big to be from any small animal, and the angle was all wrong for them to be random damage. I couldn't figure out what could have caused them. The pattern almost looked like something had been clawing at the walls. No sign of human footprints, no sign of actual people. Yet I had the strongest feeling that we weren't alone. Marcus and I tried to stay calm and stick to our routine, clear each area, take mental notes, stay focused on the objective. But there was this vibration sometimes. It felt like the floor shook, or maybe the walls were humming. It was subtle, so subtle that if I mentioned it to someone else they might think I was imagining it. But Marcus felt it too. We were both sure some kind of heavy machinery was running somewhere below us. It didn't make sense because the place looked completely out of commission. There wasn't even functional power, so where was this vibration coming from? We decided to explore lower levels, expecting to find a generator or something mechanical. We found a narrow staircase leading underground. That was the worst part. The stairs were old and creaky, and the corridor below was damp and smelled like mold. My flashlight kept flickering off the walls, and the shadows seemed to dance. It felt like the corridor itself was shrinking in on us. Down there, we noticed some lights still flickering. They looked like emergency lights that hadn't fully died out yet. It's bizarre they had lasted this long. The corridor led to an open area that looked like some sort of makeshift station. There were medical supplies, random tools, a few boxes of canned food. Not brand new, but not ancient either. It was clear somebody had been here more recently than we expected. I kept looking over my shoulder. My instincts were on high alert. Marcus kept scanning with his rifle. Neither of us spoke much. It was just head nods and hand signals. That's when we heard this loud crash from somewhere off to the side, a separate tunnel branching from the main corridor. It sounded like heavy metal hitting concrete. We moved in slowly, trying not to get separated or cornered. Every breath I took felt heavier, like the oxygen levels were dropping. I had a weird sense of nausea, the same feeling I've had on dives when something's wrong with my oxygen tank. But I knew it wasn't just in my head. The air was different down there, thick, maybe contaminated, or something else I can't quite explain. We ended up in a larger room where there was a broken generator in the corner, wires hanging out, oil stains all over the floor. It didn't look like it had run in years, but the entire place still had that faint vibration. There was something else too, like a presence. It felt like we were being watched, but we never got eyes on anything. My adrenaline was spiked, yet I couldn't pinpoint the source of the threat. We decided we needed to pull back and call for backup, or at least report our findings. But when we tried our radios, the signal was almost dead. We'd get static or a few garbled words, then nothing. That definitely raised the tension. If we lost communication, we'd have to rely on each other and our own skill set in a place that clearly wasn't what it seemed. We headed back upstairs to find a spot with a clearer signal. It was a lot harder to keep our composure now. The entire building felt alive in a very unsettling way. When we finally reached the upper floors, we both heard footsteps, quick, light, almost like they were running circles around us, then vanishing. We only caught flashes in our peripheral vision. Could have been a trick of the light, but it spooked us more than I like to admit. We tried calling out, but nobody responded. Just silence again. At some point, I heard what sounded like a voice, muffled, coming from somewhere above us. I couldn't make out the words, if there were any. It might have been someone whispering. Then it just stopped. We swept through a couple of rooms but found no one. The tension kept rising, and we decided it was best not to push our luck. We still had enough intel to tell our superiors something strange was definitely going on. We maintained a tight formation, rifles ready, and made our way toward the exit. The corridors seemed longer than before, like the building was messing with us. My nerves were on edge, but we stuck to procedure. Finally, we reached the exit. The second we got outside, I felt the cold Detroit wind hit me, and honestly, I was relieved. My lungs gulped in fresh air, and that sense of pressure lifted a bit. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind us, maybe watching from a window or a crack in the wall. Marcus felt it too. We didn't see anything, but we had that gut-wrenching certainty that we'd only scraped the surface of whatever was down there. We drove back to the base, trying to calm down and piece together what had just happened. Neither of us was sure what to believe. On one hand, it could have been people running an illicit operation we just couldn't pinpoint. On the other hand, those scratch marks, the weird vibrations, the flickering emergency lights in a place that shouldn't have power, it all made no logical sense. It's been years, and I still can't explain it. That day stuck with me. Every detail, every sensation. All I know is, something in that abandoned Detroit warehouse was off, and it felt bigger than just a group of squatters or criminals. We filed our report, but by the time anyone got around to sending more personnel to investigate, it was like the whole building had gone silent again. No fresh clues, no answers. Even now, remembering it sends chills up my spine. I've been in war zones, I've been in life-or-death situations, but nothing left me with the same sense of complete unknown as that day. I sometimes wonder if we stumbled onto something that wasn't meant to be found, or if it was just a series of odd coincidences. Whatever the case, I can't forget those shadows moving in the corners, the vibrations under my feet, and that suffocating feeling that we were standing in a place where we weren't welcome. Every time I think back, I wish I had more to tell, but all I have is that memory and the unsettling truth that to this day, I still don't know what was in those lower levels. It all began and ended in the same day, and there's never been a solid explanation. I guess some things in Detroit's forgotten places remain hidden for a reason. I just never expected to come face to face with that reality in such a disturbing way, and honestly, I hope I never experience anything like it again. Story 5. Back in 2008, I was a Navy SEAL specializing in intelligence, and I got assigned to investigate a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of Detroit. The city was already in rough shape, but the area I was sent to was practically abandoned, just scattered piles of trash and rusted fences leaning every which way. I still remember feeling this strange tension in the air the moment I stepped out of my car. It was late afternoon, a gray sky overhead, and the streets were dead silent. It felt like the kind of place that no one really walked around in, even during the day. I'd done some quick recon beforehand, mostly talking to a couple of local contacts. They gave me vague stories about unusual noises at night, weird lights flickering in this old warehouse, and rumors about large figures moving around inside. Nothing concrete. Part of me thought it was just another case of squatters, maybe a small-time drug lab. But there was a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. Something about the tone of those who gave me the intel seemed genuinely spooked. When I got there, I decided not to make a big scene by bringing a team. I just parked my car about 3 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance on foot. The warehouse stood behind a tall chain-link fence with barbed wire on top, but the fence was half collapsed, so I managed to slip through a gap without much trouble. The building looked exactly how you'd picture a forgotten industrial site: broken windows, sagging walls, rusted beams on the outside. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. But I spotted what seemed like fresh tire tracks near a side entrance, a sign that somebody had been coming in and out. I had a small gear bag with me, just the essentials: a pistol, a couple spare mags, a flashlight, some compact cameras for surveillance, and a small device to scan for electronic signals. My plan was simple: get in, verify if anything suspicious was really going on, and if necessary, set up some hidden cameras. I remember my heart rate was elevated, but nothing too out of the ordinary. Just the kind of adrenaline that always kicks in before entering an unknown environment. I found a side door with its lock practically falling off. After a quick check, I slowly eased it open. As soon as I stepped inside, I was hit by this thick, stale smell. It reminded me of wet metal and rotting wood, mixed with something else I couldn't place. It was cold and dim, with only a few stray beams of sunlight poking through the cracked windows. Every footstep echoed in a way that made me feel completely exposed, so I tried my best to move quietly. I noticed footprints in the dust. Some looked relatively recent, although I couldn't tell how many people had been through. The walls were covered with graffiti and chipped paint, and I saw a few scattered crates with weird scratch marks on them, as if someone, or something, had raked sharp nails across the wood. The deeper I went, the more this anxious feeling grew in my chest. It was like the whole place was watching me. I walked down a narrow corridor that led away from the large open area into a smaller annex. The passage was lined with broken light fixtures hanging from the ceiling. Every so often, I'd catch the drip of water leaking somewhere in the distance, echoing in the silence. It was unnerving. At one point, I paused, because I swore I heard a scraping sound, like a heavy piece of metal being dragged across the floor. But when I listened again, it went dead quiet. That moment, my skin prickled. I don't normally scare easily, but I felt like something was off. The corridor ended in a set of rooms that might have been offices or storage areas. Instead, I found what looked like makeshift lab benches, tables with stains and broken instruments scattered around. Could have been used for some kind of unofficial experiments or homemade chemistry projects. I couldn't tell. But the odor in that area was worse. It stung my nose and made my eyes water, a smell that reminded me faintly of industrial cleaners or chemicals. I ran my flashlight over the walls and noticed some bizarre symbols scrawled there, almost like they were carved or burned into the paint. I couldn't make sense of them, but they definitely weren't random tags. That's when I heard something that sounded like a low growl. It wasn't super loud, but it was deep enough to make my heart skip a beat. I froze, killing my flashlight for a few seconds to avoid drawing attention. My mind raced, trying to figure out if it was an animal, or maybe even a person trying to scare intruders away. This was Detroit. Anything was possible, but still, it didn't sound human. I waited, but the noise didn't repeat. All I could hear was my own breathing and the distant dripping. I decided to keep going, a little more cautiously. I started placing a few small cameras in spots that gave decent coverage of the hallway and those lab tables. I also set up a motion sensor near a doorway I passed. The goal was to catch whoever or whatever was roaming around. My plan was to get out without confrontation if I could avoid it, then review the footage. But right after I positioned one of the cameras on a high shelf, I heard a sudden crash, like metal shelves collapsing in the next room. The floor actually shook for a second. Instantly, I took cover behind an overturned workbench, trying to control my breathing. There was a weird dragging sound, then a thump, like someone dropped a heavy object. My gut told me to bail, but I couldn't resist at least peeking in to see if there was a direct threat. I crept into an adjoining room, noticing it was partially caved in, with water dripping from the ceiling. It was dark, but my eyes had adjusted a bit by then. The faint outline of crates and random junk looked like a twisted maze. That's where I first saw a silhouette move, a large shape slinking between the crates. It moved in a way that I'd describe as half-crouched, almost loping. The hair stood on the back of my neck, and I felt a cold sweat breaking out. I wanted to believe it was just a big guy, but something about the height and posture told me that wasn't quite right. Before I could get a clearer view, it vanished behind a stack of broken pallets. I took a step back, my heartbeat hammering. Every instinct I had told me to retreat. But I also had a job to do, so I quietly set up one more camera near the entrance to that room, hoping I'd capture whatever was there on film. As I turned to head back, I heard a harsh, scraping sound behind me, like nails or claws skidding across concrete. My flashlight was off, but some thin streaks of late afternoon light came in through a high window, just enough for me to catch a glimpse. Something tall and hunched was standing maybe 30 feet away, near a collapsed metal rack. It was too dark to see its face, but I noticed eyeshine, like you sometimes see in animals. I froze, and for a split second, neither of us moved. My stomach lurched with a fear I can't even describe. It was like every fiber in my body was screaming at me to run. Then it made this guttural, rumbling growl. It wasn't deafening, but it carried a sense of raw aggression. I slowly started backing away, never taking my eyes off that shadowy figure. My hand was on my pistol, but I had a feeling that firing a shot might set this thing off in a way I couldn't handle alone. Every step I took, it seemed to shift its weight slightly, like it was deciding whether to come at me. I can't tell you how long that standoff lasted. Probably just a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Suddenly, I heard a loud clang echo in another part of the warehouse. Maybe something fell over, or a piece of sheet metal got knocked loose. The sound broke whatever tension held the figure in place. In a single fluid motion, it bolted into the darkness. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think straight. I didn't dare follow it. I took that chance to get out of there, moving as quietly and quickly as I could, half expecting the thing to ambush me from behind at any moment. Once I made it to the corridor, I barely remembered the route back. I just remember the suffocating silence, the stench of the place, and my own ears straining for any sign of pursuit. I reached the side exit I'd come through, shoved it open, and slipped outside into the cold air. I'd parked a few blocks away, but even that short distance felt like miles. My hands were shaking when I finally got in my car. I drove back to my temporary base in the city, running through the encounter in my mind on repeat. That shape, the scratches, those weird chemical smells. None of it made sense. Part of me wanted to believe it was some animal experiment gone wrong, or even a hoax. But I couldn't forget how deliberate the movement felt. Nothing about that warehouse felt normal. I managed to upload the footage from the cameras I'd set, but the reception was so bad I couldn't review it in real time. I just hoped something on there would prove I wasn't losing my mind. To this day, I haven't been given any official confirmation about what was in that building. The higher-ups told me to stand by for further instructions after I submitted my report, but eventually the whole thing just got dropped. I never heard another word about it. I still get chills when I think about the silent stare of that figure and how it seemed almost calculated. I've been in hostile territory before, but I've never felt a primal dread like I did in that warehouse. It's one thing to face an armed enemy. It's another to confront something you can't even classify. After I left Detroit, I tried to ask around, see if anybody else had had a similar experience. But I hit dead ends. No one wanted to talk, or maybe they genuinely didn't know, and I'm still stuck with more questions than answers. Whatever was in that place, it didn't behave like any person or animal I've ever encountered. I can't offer any official explanation. I just know that night, something was prowling among those broken crates, and it felt menacing in a way I can't shake, even after all these years. It still makes me uneasy thinking that I have no idea what it was, or if it's still out there. Sometimes the simplest explanation is that certain things are just beyond our understanding, and for my own sanity, maybe it's better I never find out. Story 6. I still get this tight feeling in my chest whenever I think about that day back in 2010. It was supposed to be a straightforward job. Get in, retrieve a batch of documents left behind in some decommissioned underground facility near Death Valley, and get out. I'd done similar operations before, but there was something off about this one from the start, something I still can't quite shake. We landed early in the morning, trying to beat the worst of the heat. I remember the sun felt like it was pressing down on the top of my head, so bright I could hardly see without squinting. My team was small, me, Tiberius Knox, and Yolanda Creed. We were all used to harsh conditions, but the dryness out there was like nothing else. The wind was hot and stale, sometimes carrying a gritty taste of sand. I honestly thought the challenge would just be the temperature or dehydration. Turns out I was dead wrong. We had coordinates for a hidden entrance. The place itself was basically camouflaged among rocks and low shrubs. From the outside, it looked more like a random crag in the desert than an underground installation. I remember Tiberius joking that the camouflage was too good. Even if you knew where to look, you could walk right past it. Once we moved a metal panel aside, though, a dark corridor yawned open at our feet. The second we stepped in, that musty, stagnant air hit us. It smelled like old dust and damp concrete, with a weird chemical tinge underneath. It was oddly cold, too, a stark contrast to the sweltering desert above. Our flashlights cast beams that seemed to barely pierce the murk. Each step echoed off the walls in a dull, hollow way. That's when I first felt something like a low-level hum. Could have been an old generator somewhere, or maybe just my nerves, but it felt like the air was buzzing. We found broken crates and busted-up furniture scattered along the corridors. Papers were all over the floor, some half-burned, others soaked with who knows what. It looked like the place had been abandoned in a hurry, with no real time to do it in an orderly way. Yolanda pointed out some computers that looked deliberately torched. Someone wanted to destroy them beyond repair. Tiberius noticed these huge scratch marks in the concrete floor, the kind that might be left if someone dragged heavy machinery. But there was no sign of any large equipment around, so we had no explanation for where those marks came from. We moved further in, checking room after room. Most were stripped of anything valuable. A few labs still had random test tubes and metal instruments, but nothing we were looking for. Eventually, we hit the main chamber. It was big, bigger than I expected, lined with these tall file cabinets and a rusted control panel in the center. Off to one side, there was a hefty-looking vault, the kind you'd need special equipment to crack. We figured that's where the documents would be. Tiberius started working on the vault, trying to bypass some old locking mechanism. Meanwhile, Yolanda was poking around the control panel, hoping to see if anything was still operational. I kept my eyes on the corridor we came from, just out of habit. In the distance, I thought I heard something like a scrape or a thump, but it was faint, and I chalked it up to old pipes settling. Then the noise got louder, like a raspy breathing sound, or maybe dragging footsteps. I can't really describe it well. It was just something that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. It came from somewhere down that corridor, where the flashlight beams didn't reach. I motioned for Yolanda and Tiberius to be quiet, and my stomach lurched when they both froze and turned to listen. We all heard it. It was definitely not just my imagination. I signaled Tiberius to keep working but stay alert. He sped up his attempts on the vault's lock. Yolanda whispered that whatever was out there, it sounded big. I wasn't sure if it was a person or multiple people or something else entirely, but the heaviness in the air intensified. My heart was pounding so loud it felt like it was echoing off the walls. Finally, Tiberius managed to click open the vault door. Inside, there was a stack of folders wrapped in plastic. Nothing else, just those documents. We stuffed them into our packs and prepared to leave as quietly as possible. But it was like the second we got them in our hands, that noise from the corridor got closer. It sounded like heavy steps, then a pause, then more steps, almost too slow, like whoever or whatever it was knew we were there and was taking its time moving in. We decided to try a different way out, hoping we could avoid a direct run-in. There was a side corridor that Yolanda had noticed earlier. It seemed to lead upward, maybe to another exit hatch. We flicked our flashlights back on and formed a tight formation, moving carefully but fast. Every so often, I'd look back and catch a shadow flickering in the beam. It always moved just out of view, almost like it didn't want to be seen head-on. I can still feel that sensation of being watched, like something was right behind me, close enough that I could hear its breath if I just stopped moving. My arms were slick with sweat, partly from fear, partly from the stale heat inside that place. The corridor walls felt tighter and narrower the further we went. Pieces of broken light fixtures dangled from the ceiling, occasionally clanking and making me jump. We finally reached a small stairwell that led to an upper level. The steps were corroded, and each one squeaked painfully under our weight. Tiberius took the lead, shining his flashlight upward. Near the top, we heard a dull thud echo through the concrete. It sounded like something slamming against a wall or a door, maybe just a few feet to our right. My heart started pounding even harder. I swear I felt it in my throat. We didn't waste time investigating. The moment we made it up those stairs, we followed a short hallway that ended in a battered metal hatch. It looked like it might open up to the surface. The worst part is we had to fight with that hatch for almost half a minute, pushing and pulling until Tiberius managed to pop it loose. By then, I was sure we'd feel a hand, or something, on our shoulders at any second. Sunlight never felt so good. Even though it was scorching outside, the bright desert air was a relief. We crawled out into a cluster of rocks not far from where we'd initially gone in. We regrouped, barely speaking, because I think we were all a little shocked. We'd gone in expecting just an abandoned facility, maybe some minor hazards, but this felt bigger and more unsettling than any of us anticipated. Once we were back on the surface, we scrambled to get a comm signal. The dryness made my mouth feel like sandpaper, but I didn't care. I just wanted out of there. Eventually, we got through to our evac helicopter, which was already circling the area. We flagged them down from a small clearing and got picked up. The entire time I kept checking over my shoulder, convinced I'd see something come crawling out of that hidden hatch. But nothing did. We returned to base and handed over the documents. If I'm being honest, the files themselves barely registered in my mind. I was stuck replaying those scraping sounds, the heavy breathing, that sense of being watched in the darkness. I've run dozens of missions where things went sideways, but this one still makes my skin crawl. Some people at the base tried to write it off as desert critters or echoes in an old building, but I know what I felt. We all did. Tiberius clammed up about it right away. He's not the type to dwell on things. Yolanda avoided talking about it as well, though she did mention once that she'd seen a shadow move against the wall when there was no direct light source to cause it. No official explanation ever surfaced. We filed our reports, we turned over the evidence, and that was the end of it. Officially, anyway. To this day, I have no idea what was in there with us. All I know is that the second we got those documents, whatever it was, seemed intent on making sure we didn't hang around. I'll never forget that feeling. Even now, sometimes I jolt awake at night and swear I can hear that slow, heavy breathing. I think about those deep scratches in the floor, and it makes me wonder what else might be buried out there in the desert. We got out alive, and the mission was a success on paper, but that day in Death Valley still haunts me in a way no other operation ever has. It started out ordinary, then turned into one of the most unnerving experiences of my career, and there's still not a single piece of solid proof telling us exactly what we encountered. It feels like we brushed up against something we were never meant to see, something that made a permanent mark on my memory. After that mission, I never looked at places like Death Valley the same way again. Sometimes I catch myself staring at the horizon, half expecting to see a dark figure lurking where the sand meets the sky. But just like that day, there's never anything there, just silence and a lingering dread I can't fully explain. Story 7. I remember heading out to Smithfield Lake with James back in 2012 like it was yesterday. I'd heard stories about strange disappearances, but I always figured local rumors tended to get exaggerated. I'd been trained for high-pressure situations, so I thought I could handle anything that came my way. But let me tell you, I wasn't ready for what we faced out there. Right when we arrived, the place looked normal enough. The lake's surface was mirror still, and the surrounding trees were so dense it was hard to see more than a few feet in. We set up our camp in a small clearing right by the shore. The first night was quiet, which almost made me feel silly for getting worked up over a bunch of news reports. Still, there was a heaviness in the air, like the whole place was watching us. I remember James joking around to break the tension, and I tried to laugh it off too, but deep down, it felt like something was off. The next morning, our second day, was when things took a turn. I decided to circle the lake's edge to get a feel for the terrain. That's when I found these massive footprints in the mud. I'm used to looking for tracks, and I know the difference between a bear print and something else. These were way too big, and the shape was all wrong. They had some strange spacing, like whatever made them walked on two legs, but dragged part of its foot. My heart started pounding because all of a sudden, the stories about missing people didn't sound so exaggerated anymore. Meanwhile, James found these deep scratches on some trees closer to where we'd set up camp. They were spread out like claw marks, but each groove was so long and so deep, I couldn't picture any animal I knew doing that. I remember running my fingertips over the marks and feeling the torn bark crumble under my nails. Right there, I knew we'd stumbled onto something that probably wasn't just a rumor. We spent the afternoon setting up a couple of cameras around the edges of our camp, plus a few near the thickest part of the woods. My gut said we should record anything unusual. Then we agreed to split up that night so we could cover more ground. It wasn't the smartest plan in retrospect, but we figured we'd have a better chance of spotting whatever was out there if we positioned ourselves differently. I chose a spot close to the lake, under some brush cover, where I could see the water and any movement along the shore. James posted up on a rocky overlook, looking down with binoculars that had a thermal feature. That night, the wind started up, rustling the tree branches and making this weird low whistle through the pines. It gave me goosebumps, like the woods itself was alive. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap somewhere behind me, and every single time, I found myself gripping my flashlight and scanning the dark. That eerie feeling never let up. Sometime after midnight, I heard this deep, distant thumping sound across the water. It wasn't thunder or anything normal like that. It sounded almost like someone was hitting a big wooden drum, but very far away. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I began moving toward the noise, one careful step at a time, my flashlight sweeping across the trunks. My mind was racing, thinking about those footprints and scratches. James was watching from above, probably seeing nothing on his thermal, because he didn't radio me about any heat signatures. But I could feel it. Something was out there. As I moved around a bend in the shoreline, my flashlight caught a glimpse of fast movement between the trees. It was just a flash, a big, dark figure slipping from one trunk to another. My heart felt like it was slamming against my chest. I tried to focus my beam where I saw it, but there was nothing. Then, right when I was about to shrug it off as my eyes playing tricks, I saw it again, just for half a second, tall, broad-shouldered, unnaturally quick. It moved in a way I can't fully explain, almost gliding between the branches. That's when I whispered into my radio for James, telling him I'd just seen something big. I could hear the tension in his voice as he said he was coming down. Usually I'm not one to back away from a threat, but there was a heavy feeling in the air, a sense that we were in over our heads. When James and I finally met up near the tree line, he looked spooked. Even though he hadn't seen anything up on his vantage point, he could feel that same sinister atmosphere. It felt like we were being watched, maybe even surrounded. I remember scanning around with my flashlight, seeing shadows that didn't make sense. The forest was almost silent, too silent. No crickets, no frogs, no typical night sounds. We both decided right then that following whatever it was deeper into the woods was a bad idea. We'd heard it moving, we'd seen the footprints and the scratches, and we knew it was big and fast. All our training told us to be rational. This wasn't a fight we were prepared for, so we headed back to the clearing where our tents were. Every few steps, I'd hear a snap or the rustle of leaves behind us, like something was tailing us. But every time I spun around, my beam only caught more trees and dense undergrowth. The rest of that night was pure tension. James and I stayed up, taking turns scanning the perimeter. At one point, I heard what sounded like faint knocks on a tree, spaced out, like communication signals. Once or twice, I swear I heard heavy breathing from beyond the brush. By the time dawn finally broke, it felt like the entire lake area took a breath of relief with us, like some invisible pressure had lifted. We spent the early morning checking around our camp for any signs of a visitor. Sure enough, we found new tracks, bigger than the ones I'd seen the day before, circling around the tents. That meant something was definitely lurking around us overnight. We also noticed branches snapped off near head height, not just small twigs, but thicker limbs that seemed twisted off. My stomach tightened. In all my experiences, I'd never seen anything like this. After a quick discussion, we both agreed we were in too deep without the right backup or gear. We decided to pack up our cameras and evidence. We had footage that showed some weird movements in the tree line, nothing super clear, but enough to prove something was there. We also took photos of the footprints and the damaged trees. When we left Smithfield Lake that morning, I felt this combination of relief and dread. Relief that we were still in one piece. Dread because I knew we'd barely scratched the surface of whatever was going on. We gave everything we found to the local authorities, but as expected, they kept quiet. Maybe they didn't want to spook people. Maybe they didn't believe us. I have no idea. All I know is that place wasn't normal. Something was watching us from the woods, something with size and intelligence. The local fishermen's stories of missing hikers didn't feel like tall tales anymore. We got out of there with plenty of questions and zero real answers. To this day, I can't explain what we saw or heard. Sometimes I find myself replaying those moments in my head. The weird footprints, the feeling of being stalked, that large shape darting among the trees, and I still don't know what to make of it. It's been years, but I can't shake the feeling that we discovered something we weren't supposed to. We walked away, but I'm not convinced that thing stayed hidden. Part of me wonders if whatever's out there is still roaming the banks of Smithfield Lake, silently waiting for whoever crosses its path. And no matter how much time goes by, I still can't explain how or why it all stopped, just as suddenly as it started. It's like it wanted to show us just enough to keep us up at night, but not enough to give us any real proof. I'm sure I'll be questioning that place for the rest of my life. Story 8. I remember the exact moment I stepped out of the vehicle and felt the chill against my face. It was mid-2013, and I was deployed to Salem, Oregon, along with my teammates Owen Nealon and Andy Clark, to investigate a string of disappearances near this old research center buried deep in the woods. It sounded like a routine intel gathering mission, but I had this nagging feeling the second my boots touched the ground that something was different. We parked just outside the forest perimeter, and I could already sense the unease creeping in. Owen, being the joker he always was, made some crack about secret agents afraid of ducks. And yeah, we all chuckled a bit. I think we laughed mostly because we needed any bit of humor to cut through the tension. There was a heavy fog rolling in, hovering low between the massive tree trunks. The whole place felt off, like we weren't supposed to be there. We started trudging through the woods, following coordinates that should lead us to an abandoned cabin. The path was overgrown, and the mud was thick enough to slow us down. I remember checking my watch constantly, not because I was on a strict schedule, but because the atmosphere made every second feel longer. The quiet was almost suffocating. Even Owen got quieter the deeper we went. Eventually, we spotted the outline of this run-down cabin through the fog. The windows were smashed or missing entirely, and the front door seemed about one good kick away from falling off its hinges. The place looked like it hadn't been properly used in years, but we found signs that someone had been there recently. A makeshift bedroll, a half-burned candle on a table, and, most unsettling, deep scratches in the wood along the walls. They weren't random. They seemed deliberate, almost like someone had clawed at the cabin out of desperation or rage. It didn't feel normal at all. I tried radioing our base, but the signal was weak. Static and garbled words came through, so I managed to send only a brief status update before the line cut off. We decided to press on. I felt a knot in my stomach about going deeper, but that was our job. We found some footprints near a back corner of the cabin leading away into thicker undergrowth, so we followed them. That's when we discovered this hidden entrance, like a hatch camouflaged against the ground. I don't know if it was the leftover adrenaline, but I remember my heartbeat drumming in my ears as we pried it open. A set of narrow stairs led down, and this musty smell hit us. It reminded me of basements left to rot for decades. With our flashlights on, we started descending. Everything was cramped, damp, and the echo of water droplets kept bouncing around. It felt like we'd stepped into another world. The tunnel stretched ahead in a long corridor. Our footsteps echoed in a weird, distorted way, making it hard to tell where sounds were coming from. Owen whispered something about feeling like we were in a horror movie. I shot him a look to keep quiet, and he nodded. Even though I was used to high-pressure missions, this place put me on edge like nothing else. Further in, we started seeing clues that this wasn't just some random tunnel. There were old lights lining the walls, rusted out and barely hanging. We found rotting crates with strange symbols marked on them, and the deeper we went, the more obvious it became that this was part of some larger operation. Eventually, we reached a section that looked like it had been used for experiments. Broken lab equipment, notes scattered everywhere, big industrial tanks that were now empty and covered in rust. I remember Andy kneeling down to pick up some papers scrawled with diagrams and handwritten phrases that made no sense to us. I was torn between wanting to gather evidence and wanting to get the hell out of there. That's when we heard it. Heavy, dragging footsteps down a side corridor. We froze. It sounded like something big was shuffling around, but the echo made it impossible to figure out exactly how far. My training kicked in, and we moved into a tactical formation, lights off except for minimal red beams to see where we were going. I signaled for everyone to be silent. My mouth felt dry, and I realized I was clenching my jaw so hard it hurt. We crept toward the noise, stepping as lightly as possible. Our backs were practically against the wall. Eventually, we reached a corner and peeked around into what looked like a large storage area, or maybe a lab extension. It was dimly lit by faint emergency lights, flickering in and out. I could just make out these tall support columns and abandoned desks. And in the far corner, there was this silhouette, tall and broad. It didn't look like any animal or person I'd come across before. The shape was strangely disproportionate. Long arms, hunched posture. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give us away. I could see Owen's eyes wide, and Andy looked stunned. We could hear a low, raspy sound, like breathing but more labored. It seemed fixated on something in the shadows, maybe rummaging or feeding. I couldn't really tell. We were maybe 30 yards away, half hidden behind the columns. Every single instinct in me screamed that we should pull back. I motioned for a slow retreat, and we backed away carefully, trying not to make any noise. Thankfully, it stayed focused on whatever it was doing. We had no real plan for combat in a place like that, and we were basically cut off from outside communications. The priority was to get out and report. As we moved back, we noticed another corridor leading upward. It looked like an escape ladder or auxiliary exit. At that point, I just wanted fresh air. The hallway was so cramped that we had to move single file. Water dripped down, making the steps slippery. Every little sound echoed, so each one of us stepped carefully to avoid making a racket. Near the surface, we found a heavy metal door, mostly rusted shut, but we managed to force it open enough to squeeze through. The relief when I saw daylight was indescribable. The forest was still covered in fog, but the sun was at least breaking through the canopy. I felt like I could breathe again. We moved away from the hatch, staying alert in case something followed us. Nothing did. It was quiet, almost eerily so. We hiked a short distance to a small clearing where our radios worked better. I reported in, told them we'd found more than enough to suggest a large-scale operation, possibly with some unknown biological element. I didn't mention the silhouette directly over the radio, partly because I wasn't sure what I'd even say. Some giant, unnatural figure is down there. I still can't wrap my head around it. After that, we left. We had enough intel to know this needed a bigger team or maybe specialized units to investigate further. As we drove away, I kept looking back at the tree line, wondering if I'd see something following us. I don't know if it was adrenaline or fear, but my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Owen was unusually quiet, staring at the back seat where Andy held onto those scribbled papers. None of us knew what to make of them. The little we deciphered on the way said something about transference and body augmentation, but it was all scattered notes. I handed in my report once we got to a secure location, detailing the tunnels, the abandoned research equipment, everything. I tried to be as objective as possible, but how do you file a report about something like that silhouette? I still don't have a logical explanation. Part of me wonders if it was all in our heads. Maybe we were tired and seeing things. But that smell, that sound, and those scratch marks in the cabin, they sure felt real. To this day, I haven't gotten a clear answer about what was down there. The higher-ups seemed concerned, but after a while, everything went silent. I still think about that shape I glimpsed in the corner of that underground room. It was real. I know what I saw. I have no idea if it's some experiment gone wrong, an unknown creature, or something else entirely. I never did find out what happened to the missing people. All I know is whatever was going on in those tunnels wasn't meant to be discovered, at least not by regular eyes. I left Salem with a pit in my stomach. I've seen some dark things in my line of work, but nothing that made me question reality quite like this. It felt like stepping into someone's nightmare and then coming back out without answers. The nightmares still come sometimes. I'll dream of that corridor, that flickering light, the scuffling sound of that thing dragging its feet, and then I'll wake up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering. I wish I could say I have closure, but I don't. It just stopped. We went in, found what we found, and pulled back. Mission complete, right? On paper, sure. But there's something in those woods, something they were experimenting on, or creating, or maybe just discovered. I'm not sure which possibility scares me more. And that's it. No big standoffs, no final confrontation. Everything just went quiet, and we left. But every now and then, I'll catch myself replaying those moments in my head, wondering if that shape is still there, wandering those dark tunnels, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble across its path. I don't have the answers. All I know is that I'll never forget what I saw down there, and I sure as hell don't want to go back. Story 9. I still remember that evening in 2015 like it just happened yesterday. We'd driven out to a spot near Mount Rainier, not far from Seattle. I was called in on short notice for an operation that sounded almost too strange to be real. Local campers were vanishing, and no one could tell if it was an animal, a criminal group, or something else. I'd done recon missions before, but this one felt off from the start. By late afternoon, I met with a small team of federal agents and my fellow SEALs. We all had that tension in our eyes, like we weren't sure what we were really getting into. I remember the ground was slick with recent rain, my boots sinking an inch into mud each time I took a step. The wind whipped through the trees in a weird, almost rhythmic way, not like any normal breeze. Our job was supposed to be straightforward: track down whatever was out there, figure out why these people were disappearing, and secure the area. But from the moment I stepped into the woods, I felt this heaviness in my chest, like the atmosphere was pressing down on me. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just an eerie silence. And every few minutes, I caught a hint of some low, distorted noise in the distance. It never sounded consistent, but it gave me goosebumps every time. We moved in a standard formation, rifles up, night vision gear ready since the sun was sinking fast. The deeper we went, the darker it got, and not just in the literal sense. I spotted broken branches that were way too high off the ground for normal human activity. We also found these strange footprints. They were large, but the stride was irregular, like whatever made them had a distorted gait, and there were claw-like marks on some boulders that seemed chipped in a spiral pattern. None of it made any sense. About an hour before full dark, we stumbled on what was left of a campsite. Tents were ripped open, sleeping bags lay scattered. I saw what looked like dried blood smears on a couple of the torn nylon flaps, although it was hard to confirm in the fading light. Personal items were strewn everywhere: flashlights, shoes, half-eaten food still in wrappers. We found a few notebooks and diaries, pages torn out, lines written in a rush about hearing something circling them at night. That was when I felt the first real jolt of fear, not just for the missing campers, but for what might be waiting for us. We decided to press on. I was leading the group, keeping everyone on high alert. We tried to radio back for an update or instructions, but the signal was gone. Too many trees, too much interference from the steep hills. By now, the sun had vanished, leaving only the glow of our flashlights. The quiet was so intense it made my ears ring. Then, out of nowhere, we heard it. This deep, guttural growl that seemed to echo through the entire forest. It wasn't just one sound either. There was a distortion, like multiple pitches layered together. Instinctively, we all dropped into defensive positions, scanning the tree line in every direction. The forest felt alive in the worst way, like it was about to swallow us. I could see the tension on every face. Nobody moved for a good 30 seconds. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Then we saw these two glinting eyes between some pines, reflective, like an animal, but at a height that didn't make sense. They stared at us for maybe a second, and I swear I felt them lock onto me specifically. Then they vanished. I gestured for the group to move forward slowly. We couldn't just open fire at a pair of eyes. We advanced maybe 10 yards when we heard another snap of branches off to our left. At this point, it felt like we were being corralled, like something was pushing us to a specific area. My gut told me to get out, but I also knew we had a job to do and people's lives were at stake. So we kept going, step by step, hearts rattling. Suddenly, the growling came back, much closer. It was accompanied by heavy footfalls. Whatever it was, it sounded huge. The underbrush rustled violently, and I caught a quick glimpse of something tall, dark, and impossibly fast, darting behind a thick trunk. Then silence again, but it was an electric silence, if that makes sense, like the forest was holding its breath. We kept searching for any safe spot to regroup and figure out a plan. We found a rocky ledge that overlooked a small ravine, deciding it might give us some advantage if we had to defend ourselves. But even there, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My palms were so sweaty that I almost dropped my rifle. One of the agents tried to contact base, but the radio only crackled with static. It gave me chills just hearing that broken noise in the blackness. It became clear that going deeper was a gamble we probably couldn't afford. I signaled a cautious retreat, hoping we'd make it back to a zone with better comms. We started back the way we came, weaving through the trees in a staggered formation to cover each other. That's when I heard the heavy breathing, except it wasn't any of us. It was this labored, ragged inhaling, like whatever was out there was right on top of us, but every time we whirled around, we saw nothing but shadows. Then, in the corner of my vision, I saw a dark shape move at an impossible speed, crossing the path behind one of my men. He spun around, but we were too late. We all heard a guttural snarl, followed by a crash of branches. Yet when we ran to the spot, there was nothing. No sign of the attacker, no sign of any struggle, just bent branches and a faint echo. I felt my stomach twist. It was like the forest had swallowed him without a trace. We called out his name, but we got no response. My team was on the verge of panic, but I had to keep everyone focused. We intensified our retreat, practically running at this point, but trying not to lose what little discipline we had left. I remember my breathing was so loud in my own ears that I could barely hear anything else. Every so often I could sense movements just beyond our light, shapes flickering behind the tree trunks. After what felt like an eternity, the trees thinned out, and we reached a more open clearing where the radio finally picked up a signal. We called for immediate backup and a possible airlift. While we waited, the entire group formed a defensive perimeter, guns aimed outward, scanning every angle. Those few minutes felt like hours, but nothing charged at us, nothing attacked again. The weird noise just stopped, almost like flipping a switch. By the time backup arrived, the forest was dead quiet. No more growls, no footsteps, no heavy breathing. It was like the place swallowed itself. We regrouped, counted heads, and realized we still had a missing member. We organized a quick sweep of the perimeter but found nothing. It was almost as if the forest had decided it was done with us. To this day, I have no clue what we encountered or why it acted the way it did. All I know is that we lost a man, and nobody ever found a trace of him. We filed our reports, but they didn't make much sense. Local authorities didn't have a clear explanation either. Officially, it just went down as a failed search operation. Unofficially, I've never forgotten that growl, those eyes, and that suffocating pressure in the woods. Every time I think back to that night, I get this uneasy feeling in my gut, like something out there is still watching. Maybe it's waiting. I'm still not entirely sure what we ran into near Mount Rainier, but I'll never go back there alone. Ever. I can't explain it, and I don't think I ever will. After that night, it just stopped, and that alone might be the most unsettling part of all. Story 10. I still remember the exact taste of the coffee I had that day in 2016, just before everything flipped on its head. I was in San Diego on a short break after a string of pretty intense missions. The plan was to lay low for a while, maybe let my shoulders relax for once. But as usual, duty had other ideas. My phone buzzed, and I almost ignored it. Believe me, I was that desperate for some peace. But when I saw the caller ID, I knew ignoring it wasn't an option. The voice on the other end was all business, telling me to head to an old warehouse near a mostly deserted industrial zone. They said it was a last-minute call and that I needed to handle it quietly because there was a hint of something unusual going on. I didn't love the sound of that, but as soon as I got the order, I grabbed my go bag and took off. I still had my basic SEAL gear with me, so I felt ready for whatever was coming. At least, that's what I told myself. When I pulled up, I saw two teammates outside the entrance. They looked just as puzzled as me. The place was an abandoned warehouse, tucked away behind piles of scrap metal and worn-out machinery. The walls were covered in graffiti and rust. Half the windows were shattered, and the huge metal door looked like it had been forced open before, like someone, or something, had broken in. I remember the paint on the door curling away in strips, giving off this stale, musty smell. There was a weird hush in the air, too. Even in a quiet industrial area, I usually expect some hum of distant traffic or the faint buzz of electricity. But it was dead silent. We decided to go in. It felt like stepping into a tomb, the darkness, the echo, the tension. We moved in formation, slowly checking each corridor. Our flashlight beams bounced off dusty shelves, old boxes and strange piles of debris I couldn't identify right away. My heart was thumping in my chest, not out of sheer fear, though I definitely felt uneasy, but because I could tell something wasn't right. This place felt lived in, but by what or who, I couldn't say. After a few minutes of searching, I noticed a glint of light off in a corner. I signaled the others and we moved closer. Turned out there was a makeshift setup of high-end equipment. I saw cables running to a rattling generator that looked like it had been rigged there in a hurry. No labels, no markings, just random wires going in and out. The gear seemed more advanced than your average back-alley operation, but also oddly improvised, like whoever set it up didn't want it found. I couldn't figure out what they might be testing or measuring, but it gave me a bad feeling. Some of the metal pieces had reflective surfaces that threw our flashlight beams back at us, almost like the place was glaring. We barely had time to process this when we heard something in the distance, kind of a low, muffled growl, followed by a scrape of metal on concrete. It made my skin crawl. I glanced at my teammates, and I could tell they heard it too. We split into pairs, with me leading one group. We moved toward where we thought the sound came from, passing row after row of empty shelves and half-open crates. Every step felt like it echoed forever, like we were in some giant cave. I was trying to keep steady, but my grip on my rifle was tighter than usual. We came to these huge metal doors that were slightly ajar. The corridor leading there was lit by a single flickering light overhead, which only made it creepier. There were no signs telling us what the room was for, just a thick layer of dust and rust on the hinges. We carefully pushed one door open, and our flashlights revealed a huge chamber cluttered with sealed boxes and random pipes running along the ceiling. The air was heavier in there, kind of like a humid basement or maybe a lab. The smell was metallic and off-putting, not quite chemical, but close enough that it made me uneasy. Suddenly, a sharp crack behind us made us spin around with our weapons raised. Nothing, just more darkness. But then I saw it. Long, fresh marks on the floor, like something big had been dragged through recently. I shone my light around, trying to spot more clues, but every few feet the marks just disappeared into the dimness. That's when my pulse really kicked into overdrive. I'd seen a lot during my time in the military, but this was different. It was that gut feeling that says you're being watched by something you can't see. We knew we didn't have a solid signal out here, so calling for backup wasn't an option. We had to rely on each other. A part of me wanted to keep pushing, to uncover every inch of that place, but the more logical side warned me we'd never make it out if we got stuck in a bad situation. I signaled for everyone to pull back to the central corridor with the generator. That's when we made a quick decision: gather whatever evidence we could, then get the hell out. Whatever was going on here, it was beyond a simple break-in. I took out a small camera I usually keep for intel, started snapping photos of the equipment, the generator, the strange wiring. I wanted to capture every angle, especially the bizarre layout of that machinery. There was a device with what looked like some kind of rotating dish, almost like a mini radar or something. No brand name, no manufacturer stamp, nothing. It freaked me out how advanced yet completely anonymous it all was. We regrouped near the entrance, all of us hyper-alert. The same scraping noise echoed again, this time from somewhere above us. I aimed my flashlight at the ceiling, half expecting to see a bird or maybe a broken piece of piping. But all I caught were shadows. My buddy gave me a look that said, "What the hell is going on?" And all I could do was shake my head. None of it made sense. Why this advanced setup in a rundown warehouse? Why the strange sounds? And why did I feel like we were being herded? At that point, I really thought about the possibility of some elaborate setup, maybe a top-secret test or a cover operation. But the fear in my gut told me it was something we had no business facing alone. We double-checked the perimeter, making sure we weren't leaving anyone behind. I swear I kept expecting something to jump out at us, but nothing did. Instead, it felt like the place itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to leave. You'd think I'd be relieved, but it made me even more uneasy. Our final call was to exit quietly, lock down what we could, and relay everything to command. We moved out in a tight formation, scanning every corner. My heart was still hammering, especially when a metal door somewhere deeper in the building slammed shut, echoing like a thunderclap. That was my last straw. We picked up the pace, eventually stepping back outside into the fresh night air. I didn't realize how tense I'd been until I felt the cold breeze hit my face. The weird part was how abruptly everything stopped once we were back in the open. The scraping, the metallic squeaks, the growling noise, gone. It was like the building decided we'd seen enough and let us go. It made no sense to me. We gathered near our vehicles to compare notes. None of us could fully explain what we'd seen or heard. There was some comfort in knowing I wasn't the only one who felt the dread, but it didn't help me understand it any better. We handed over the photos and footage I took, filed a report, and waited to hear what the higher-ups would say. But as far as I know, no official story ever came out about that place. I still check in every once in a while to see if there's any new intel, but it's always a dead end. Part of me wonders if that was the point. Maybe it was meant to stay hidden, no matter who stumbled in. I've seen a lot in my career, but something about that warehouse creeps me out more than any direct combat mission ever did. Not knowing what was inside or what those machines were for, it sticks with me. Even now, I'll sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that scraping sound, convinced I'm back in that pitch-black chamber. I can't explain any of it, and no one's ever given me real answers. To this day, I keep a small folder on my laptop with the photos from that night. Every so often I'll open it, hoping I'll spot something I missed. But all I see are dark corridors, weird cables, and half-lit equipment I can't identify. Whatever was lurking there, it remains just as unexplained as it was in 2016. And honestly, sometimes I wish I could just forget the whole thing happened. But I can't. Something about that warehouse won't let me, and I still don't know why. Story 11. I remember that day in 2017 like it just happened. Jonas Marone, our team lead, gathered us in a small warehouse on the outskirts of New Orleans. It was late evening, and the air was so thick it felt like it clung to my skin. Jonas was dead serious. He had that look that told us we weren't going on a routine assignment. The brief said we were supposed to check out an abandoned industrial area north of the city, where people had been hearing these weird, almost inhuman sounds. I was used to unusual ops, but something about this felt different from the start. When we arrived, the place was a mess. It looked like nature was trying to claim it. Vines creeping through cracked walls, puddles from the constant humidity, a low-hanging fog that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead sometimes. Even though we were trained for this kind of environment, I felt uneasy. There was a stillness around us, like the whole area was holding its breath. We moved in silently. No small talk, just silent hand signals. That's how we always operated, but this time, the quiet felt heavier, like the place wanted to swallow our voices. The instructions were clear: investigate, gather intel, and report back. We split into smaller teams to cover more ground. My group took the east side of the property, where a row of weathered buildings stood in various stages of collapse. The moonlight barely pierced through the grime-streaked windows. Inside the first building, we found a bunch of rusted pipes and old workbenches. Nothing too strange at first glance, except for these strange scratch marks on one of the walls. They were thick, almost jagged, like something with claws had raked the concrete. I brushed my glove over them, feeling the depth of each groove. It didn't match anything I'd seen in the wild before, and I've been in enough rough spots to recognize normal animal scratches. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept my focus. Could have been just old damage, I tried to tell myself. We moved deeper into the corridor. The floors were cracked, and each step echoed more than I liked. In the dim light, I noticed old boxes torn open, bits of packaging scattered around, like someone or something had gone through them in a hurry. I crouched down, picking up a piece of cardboard with marks that looked like they'd been made by sharp, uneven edges. My mind was racing with possibilities, maybe local vandals, maybe someone else snooping around. But the place felt wrong, like we weren't the only ones breathing that stale air. After regrouping, we joined up with Jonas's team in the main building, supposedly where most of the sounds had been reported. It was this huge open area, maybe some sort of factory floor in the past. There were tables with weird stains, could have been chemicals or who knows what. Overturned chairs, broken glass, and more wires hanging from the ceiling than I thought was normal. Some of those wires had that burnt plastic smell, almost like they'd been used in strange experiments. I felt a knot form in my stomach. We had no intel that this site was a lab or anything like that, but everything pointed to some kind of hidden operation. Jonas signaled for us to be on full alert. Then we caught a faint odor, something foul, like rotting seaweed mixed with strong chemicals. It wasn't overpowering, but it lingered in the air, thick enough to make me swallow hard. I watched Jonas's expression tighten. He looked as unsettled as I felt. We moved toward a series of smaller rooms in the back. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural sound reverberated through the hallway. I could almost feel the vibration under my boots. We all froze for a split second, scanning with our flashlights. My heart hammered against my chest so loud, I wondered if the others could hear it. We formed a defensive line, weapons up, every sense on high alert. We'd been briefed on possible intruders, but that noise didn't sound human. It was too raw, too deep. I could tell from the faces around me that everyone was on edge. Jonas pointed toward a corridor leading to a locked storage area. The door was secured by these rusted chains. Through the cracks, it was pitch dark. Then we heard the noise again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound on the metal door. I thought my heart was about to leap out of my chest. I've been in combat before, but something about the way this echoed in that dark space made my skin crawl. Jonas took a moment to assess the situation. We didn't have a clear idea of what was in there, and we were a relatively small group for a potential unknown threat. No matter how well trained we were, going in blind could turn deadly fast. The tension in the air was like a wire pulled too tight. I kept thinking about those scratch marks on the wall and the rummaged boxes. If something was down here, it was either searching for something or trying to protect something. Neither option made me feel any safer. Jonas signaled for us to pull back to the entrance. We moved carefully down the corridor again, flashlights sweeping over every corner. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, like there were eyes following our every move from somewhere in the darkness. When we finally got outside, that fog was still clinging to the ground, and the night felt a bit colder, like the temperature had dropped in the span of minutes. We headed toward our vehicles, trying to reach our comms gear to report the incident. As we were crossing the yard, I heard a third noise, distant but menacing, a kind of growl that I've never heard from any normal animal. It echoed across the open space. I turned around, shining my flashlight back at the building. I saw nothing, just broken windows and dark silhouettes. But I felt that presence, the same feeling you get when you know you're not alone, even if you can't prove it. I was glad Jonas had ordered the retreat, because every instinct in my body was screaming that we weren't prepared for whatever was in there. We got to the trucks and loaded up as fast as we could, eyes still darting to the shadows. By the time we finally drove off, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel, adrenaline making my whole body tense. Back at our temporary base, Jonas sent in his report. I didn't sleep at all that night, replaying the guttural sounds in my head, trying to figure out what we might have stumbled into. The strangest part is that, after that initial report, I never heard any official follow-up details. It was like the whole thing got swept into a classified file, and our team moved on to the next mission. Even now I get goosebumps thinking about it. That day felt like stepping into someone else's nightmare. We never truly found out what caused those noises or how those bizarre scratch marks appeared on the walls. I've been in plenty of tense operations, but this one still sits at the back of my mind whenever I hear about odd sightings or unexplained incidents. It's like a reminder that there's stuff out there we can't always label or understand. Sometimes late at night, I'll catch myself listening for a distant growl. I know it sounds paranoid, but that noise hasn't left me, and neither has the sense that there was something in that darkened corridor watching us. I guess I'll never really know what we almost confronted. Whatever it was, it stayed behind in that abandoned place north of New Orleans, and I'm still here, trying to piece it together from scattered memories. The operation ended, just like that, and so did the terror, for us at least. But to this day, I can't explain it, and it still sends chills through me whenever I recall that single, impossible night. Story 12. I still can't believe how that day played out. It was 2018, and I'd just been sent to the Grand Canyon area for an emergency recon mission. At first, it sounded routine, some weird reports in a tourist-heavy spot, but we all knew it was enough to raise concern among higher-ups. As a SEAL, I was trained to tackle the unexpected, but nothing in my background fully prepared me for what I experienced there. We arrived at a tiny lookout station, a place barely bigger than a tool shed, tucked away near one of the harder-to-reach trails. I met up with my team, and we went through our briefing. Possible unknown threats, strange sightings, big footprints, stuff that didn't match typical wildlife. We had topographic maps, climbing gear, everything we needed for a rugged landscape. Still, a part of me felt uneasy. The Grand Canyon is majestic, but it can also swallow you whole if you're not careful. That entire first day was almost painfully slow. The sun was merciless, and every step kicked up hot dust that stuck in my throat. We saw random footprints, way too large for standard animals, but no solid evidence of what was making them. We also found scrape marks in the dusty rock, like something heavy had dragged itself across the ground. The atmosphere was tense, but we kept pushing. We were used to tough terrains, but the heat and the subtle feeling of being watched hung over us like a weight. By late afternoon, we reached a narrow corridor of rock that locals said was rarely visited. We split into small pairs to check the area, marking anything unusual on our GPS devices. I was with two other guys, and the place felt unreal, like a massive stone hallway with sheer walls. The sunlight was disappearing fast, and it painted everything in orange and crimson. I remember rubbing my eyes, thinking it was just exhaustion, but something in that light made the canyon feel alive, like it was breathing in sync with us. We decided to set up a temporary overlook on a ridge. It gave us a good vantage point to see anything moving below and enough height to try radioing the base. But the radio crackled with bizarre interference, and we struggled to keep a steady signal. The wind started whining through the cracks in the canyon walls, making this eerie, high-pitched sound. It's hard to describe without hearing it yourself, but it set my nerves on edge. Every time it howled, I got this crawling sensation on the back of my neck. Night fell quickly in that canyon. The last sliver of sunlight vanished behind the jagged peaks, and darkness flooded in. I could feel the temperature drop, but I didn't mind the cool air as much as I minded the unsettling silence. There was a moment, maybe an hour after sunset, when I was on night watch. Suddenly, a deep rumble echoed through the valley. It wasn't a typical canyon echo. It felt more like a muffled roar coming from behind the rocks or from underground. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but I glanced at my teammate, and his eyes were already wide. He'd heard it too. We went into immediate alert, scanning the area with our night vision. The rest of the team quickly gathered, quiet and focused. You know that feeling when adrenaline surges and your senses go into overdrive. My heartbeat pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The noise came again, this time sharper, almost like a hiss combined with a guttural growl. It seemed to move from one side of the canyon to the other, yet we couldn't pinpoint a source. I spotted movement in the distance, a fleeting shadow near a stack of boulders. Then it vanished. We tried to keep our cool, but the tension was out of control. We advanced a little farther down into a part of the canyon floor, trying to see if we could spot tracks or signs of a large animal. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing scattered stones, twisted shrubs, and more of those enormous footprints pressed into the dirt. They weren't just big, they were misshapen, like elongated claws or toes. I remember bending down to touch one of them, feeling how deep the impression went. It was something heavier than any creature I'd encountered on land. All the while, we heard these thumping sounds, like it was pacing around us, but never close enough to see it plainly. It kept this maddening distance, making it impossible to engage or even identify. Every so often the wind would carry another faint growl or a sharp wheeze, reminding us we were not alone in that darkness. It was like playing hide-and-seek with something that had the upper hand. After what felt like hours of near-constant alert, we had to make a decision. We collected as many samples and photographs as we could. Photos of the footprints, shots of the strange scratch marks on the rocks, even some soil samples in small plastic bags. We wanted to bring it all back to our command and request more resources. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something a small recon team should handle on its own. The unpredictability of that creature, combined with the rough canyon terrain, screamed for backup. Packing up our gear in the pitch-black darkness was nerve-wracking. We kept hearing faint footsteps around us, sometimes from behind, sometimes from overhead ridges. Once, I thought I saw a silhouette climbing along the canyon wall, almost spider-like in its movements, but it slipped out of sight before I could confirm. My hands were shaky, and every muscle in my body was on edge, expecting an attack any second. We quietly made our way back toward the ridge where we'd set up our initial lookout, hoping to circle around and reach our makeshift base. Every minute I'd snap my head around, convinced something was right behind me. The desert floor crunched under our boots, and that sound alone felt like a magnet for whatever was stalking us. At one point, a loud scraping noise tore through the stillness, like metal against stone. We froze, hearts pounding, scanning every rock and crevice. Nothing, just emptiness. But I swear something was just out of sight, watching. When we finally reached the base, we were drenched in sweat, breathing hard. Our radio connection was spotty, but we managed to call in that we were returning. As we secured the perimeter, There was one last growl that echoed across the canyon walls. It felt both threatening and final, like it was telling us we'd stepped into its domain and it was letting us go. For now. Then silence. The entire canyon went dead quiet again. No more footsteps, no more scratching. Just the gusts of wind and our own ragged breathing. It was the most unnerving calm I've ever felt. We regrouped inside the small station, hearts still racing. We never got a clear view of what we'd been dealing with that night. All we had were those prints, the claw marks, some shaky camera shots, and the absolute certainty that we weren't alone out there. Later, I wrote up a detailed report, attaching the evidence we'd gathered. Officially, we didn't conclude anything. We had no proof beyond the footprints, marks, and strange noises. But every person on my team felt it. Something huge lurked in those deeper canyons, something that didn't fit the usual wildlife we knew. After a while, the higher-ups took our information, but I never heard of any large-scale operation going back to check. To this day, I get chills thinking about those echoes in the canyon and that low, rumbling growl. Whatever it was powerful enough to leave footprints that size and agile enough to remain hidden. I've run countless missions since then, but that night at the Grand Canyon sticks with me. It started out like any other recon, but it ended with this overwhelming sense of dread and mystery that I still can't shake off. And just like that, it was over. The next morning, the canyon looked normal. Just a breathtaking view that tourists flock to every year. Yet even now, I can't explain what we encountered. Sometimes I wonder if that thing is still there, tucked away in some uncharted cavern, waiting for the next group to wander too far. I have no answer, and maybe I never will. But I can't forget the feeling that we came far too close to something nobody was prepared to deal with. Story 13. I still remember that day in 2019 when I got assigned to investigate strange reports coming from Alcatraz. I'm a former SEAL, and my record was spotless at the time. I've been through all sorts of high-stakes operations, but there was always something about Alcatraz that felt heavier, like the place carried its own memories of dread. It used to be a federal prison, later a tourist site, but there were still sections completely off-limits to the public, areas used for government research or whatever else they didn't want us to see. I arrived on the island late in the afternoon. You know that moment when the sun is about to set, casting long shadows everywhere? That was the exact atmosphere. The wind coming from the bay was sharper than I anticipated, and the empty walkways around those old buildings just put me on edge right away. I was supposed to meet Chester Greer and Shant Farnsworth, who specialize in confined space infiltration. We'd all heard the rumors of bizarre events in some abandoned underground tunnels. We didn't have much to go on, except that people claimed to have heard unearthly noises or seen shapes moving in the dark. We started out by checking a security monitoring room that supposedly had camera feeds from these restricted areas. But when we got there, most of the equipment was trashed, like someone had deliberately destroyed the key components. No recordings, no archived footage, nothing. It was frustrating because that left us totally in the dark about what we might be dealing with. Since we couldn't rely on the monitors, we decided to head below ground and see if we could verify the rumors ourselves. The entrances to these tunnels weren't marked on any official maps. They're old maintenance corridors that run underneath parts of the island, laced with rusted pipes, broken lighting fixtures and puddles of stagnant water. It was silent down there, except for the sound of water dripping and our own boots scraping along the concrete. We passed by a series of locked, corroded doors. Some looked recently patched up, but the repair work wasn't completed, or maybe whoever started just abandoned it. That felt weird in itself, because these passages aren't supposed to have much foot traffic. At some point, this loud metallic scraping noise echoed down the tunnel, almost like someone dragging a huge piece of iron across the floor. We froze for a second, exchanging glances. Even after everything I've encountered in my career, that sound set my nerves on edge. It came from up ahead, maybe around a bend. We turned off most of our flashlights except one, trying to be discreet. We moved slowly toward the direction of the noise, forming up in a tactical sweep. After a few minutes, we found an old storage room, possibly used for maintenance equipment ages ago. It was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. My first impression was that the place was a dumping ground for forgotten junk. Old metal wheelchairs, broken furniture, random gear in crates. As I scanned the area with my flashlight, I noticed deep scratch marks along the concrete walls. They weren't small either, long, jagged gouges that definitely didn't look like they were made by standard tools. I ran my hand over one of the deeper grooves, and it felt like something incredibly strong had just ripped across the surface. The metal shelving in the corner had similar marks, like claws had raked across it. I felt this chill roll through my body, and not just because the air was cold. Suddenly, Chester aimed his flashlight upward, and I caught the briefest glimpse of a huge shadow darting across the ceiling. It was fast, almost too quick for my eyes to register. Shant saw it too, and we all sort of sucked in a breath. My heart started pounding. I'd been in firefights. I'd seen some horrifying things overseas, but this was different. I couldn't even label what I saw. It was just wrong. We decided to pull back into the main corridor because we had a little more room to maneuver there. Those tunnels can get claustrophobic, and with something potentially hostile lurking overhead, we wanted some space in case things went bad. As we moved out, we heard this low growl echo in the distance. I'd never heard anything like it. It was almost like a deep rumbling snarl, not exactly an animal, but not entirely human either. It made my skin crawl, and every instinct told me we had to get out of there. Our plan was to contact backup, but the radio link was nearly useless underground. We managed to send a few broken transmissions, but nothing clear. We had no idea if anyone topside was receiving us properly. In that moment, I realized we were isolated in these deserted tunnels with something we couldn't even put a name to. We tried to make our way toward an exit route, stepping carefully, scanning every corner with flashlights. At one point, the overhead emergency lighting flickered for just a second, throwing these eerie shadows all over the walls. In that brief flash, I saw it again. A tall, hunched figure racing along the far end of the corridor with this unnatural speed. I swear it wasn't my imagination. Chester gasped, Shant swore under his breath, and I just felt every hair on the back of my neck stand up. This thing, or whatever it was, definitely knew we were there. I couldn't tell if it was taunting us or trying to figure us out. We'd only see it for tiny fractions of a second, but that was enough to confirm it was big, maybe around 7 feet tall if I had to guess, but so thin and strangely proportioned that my brain couldn't process it as human. The atmosphere in those tunnels suddenly felt suffocating, like the air itself had turned hostile. I made a snap decision. We needed to abort the mission. There was no point in continuing deeper without backup or proper equipment to deal with something so unknown. Even if it turned out to be some weird hoax, it was too dangerous to keep going blind. We moved fast toward the surface, adrenaline spiking with every step. Every time a pipe rattled or water dripped, my pulse jumped, anticipating another encounter with that silhouette. When we finally got above ground, the daylight was gone, and the island was enveloped in the kind of darkness you only experience in remote locations. We found a boat transport back to the mainland. Luckily, we were able to wave them down at the dock. None of us spoke much during the ride. It's like we were trying to process what we had seen and figure out if we'd lost our minds. We'd all been trained to handle fear and stress, but that day on Alcatraz was different. It's something I still can't fully explain. That was the end of our inspection. No official debrief gave us any solid answers, and as far as I know, no one else has openly talked about investigating it again. I've had nightmares since, replaying that flicker of a giant shape, those horrible scratches on the walls, that awful growl. Sometimes I wonder if it was some experimental creature, or just a psychological trick from being in a place with so much grim history. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that there's something lurking under Alcatraz, something that moves in the shadows and leaves behind those impossible claw marks. We never went back. Our higher-ups either decided not to push the issue or got more specialized teams to do it quietly. I still can't confirm any of that. All I know is that day felt like stepping into a horror movie, except it was real. It's been years, and I still get chills when I think about it. I don't have a neat explanation or any closure, and maybe that's the scariest part. Sometimes things just happen, and we never find out why. Story 14. I still get chills just thinking about that day in Delna Woods Park. It was 2020, and my team and I were sent there after a series of disappearances, people just vanishing without a trace, leaving behind nothing but a few scattered rumors. I was part of a small SEAL unit. Myala Bulldog Ross, our demolition expert, DeAndre Blitz Pom, the best shot I've ever known, and Shant Viper Farnsworth, our medic with nerves of steel. Our orders were clear: gather intel, see if we needed a bigger force, and get out. But nothing could have prepared me for what we found. Early that morning, we rolled into the park's back entrance to keep a low profile. It was quiet, too quiet. Delna Woods had once been a family-friendly spot, but the official reports said something had changed. When we hopped off the vehicle, the silence felt thick, like the whole forest was holding its breath. No birds, no breeze, just dead stillness. We set up a small camp a few hundred yards in, hidden by the trees. Even though it was broad daylight, my instincts were on high alert. We split up to do a quick recon. I remember carefully stepping over broken branches, noticing how even the undergrowth seemed unnatural. Bulldog and Blitz went in one direction, Viper and I in another. Every now and then we'd pass by old rotted benches and faded signs for hiking trails. It was obvious no one had come here for a while. Everything had that abandoned look. After about an hour, we started spotting tracks, huge footprints that made no sense. I've been all over the world, and these weren't anything I recognized. They were way too large for any wildlife known to roam that region. I felt my stomach tighten, like my body knew something was off before my mind could fully process it. By the time we regrouped at the campsite, the sun was dipping behind the towering pines. We tried to come up with a plan for the night because, according to the mission briefing, things always got worse after dark. Blitz volunteered to perch on a ridge that overlooked most of the clearing, and Bulldog said she'd keep watch by this old observation post we found, half collapsed, but still standing enough to hide behind. Viper stuck with me at our central camp, ready to move at a moment's notice. We were armed and prepared, but honestly, that creeping dread in my gut wouldn't go away. Night fell fast. There was this moment, I remember it clearly, when the last bit of light vanished behind the horizon, and suddenly it was as if the whole park came alive with noises we couldn't identify. The wind started up, whispering through the treetops, but there were other sounds too, faint and distant. The only real comfort was hearing my teammates' voices over the radio, checking in every 15 minutes. That's when Blitz mentioned a weird, low rumble, almost like a muffled growl. He said he couldn't pinpoint the direction. A few minutes later, Bulldog reported similar sounds from her area. Viper and I looked at each other, and I could see in his eyes he was on edge too, even though he tried to stay collected. Around midnight, everything took a turn. Our radios started giving out bursts of static. Blitz's voice would come through, then vanish. He kept saying something about movement out there, something big. I remember grabbing my rifle, scanning the darkness, and feeling completely blind. In the middle of all the static, Blitz's voice suddenly got crystal clear for half a second. He sounded scared, a guy who almost never showed any fear. He said, "There's something huge," and then it cut off. We only heard snapping branches in the background before the signal died again. We raced out of the tent, shouting for Blitz, trying to get a lock on his position. Bulldog reported hearing loud cracking noises near her side, like trees being pushed aside or broken. She started moving toward us, but the brush was too thick. Viper was right behind me, lighting our path with his flashlight. Out of nowhere, we caught a glimpse of this massive silhouette weaving between the trees, too fast for something that large. My heart practically jumped into my throat. Viper tried to shine the beam directly on it, but we could only see fleeting details. Dark, hulking shape, definitely not human, and it moved with this unnatural speed. We made a split-second call, regroup at the rendezvous point near the edge of the park. I remember yelling Blitz's codename into the radio, hoping for any response. All we got was garbled white noise. Every few steps, we could hear something behind us. Heavy footsteps that sounded way too close, snapping branches under its weight. Sometimes it felt like it was circling us, or almost toying with us. Bulldog got there first, panting, her eyes wide. She said she tried flares, hoping it would scare it off, but the thing didn't even flinch. She could still hear it thrashing through the underbrush. We realized Blitz wasn't with us. Panic set in fast. None of us wanted to leave him out there, but we couldn't see a thing. Viper tried calling him on every channel. All we heard was this eerie crackling sound, like a broken radio stuck on some ominous frequency. I'll never forget the feeling of helplessness, standing in the middle of that pitch-black forest, hearing some monstrous creature moving just out of sight, and knowing one of our own was somewhere in the dark. Then came a moment I honestly hate to think about. We heard a single gunshot echo from deeper in the trees, just one. After that, everything went quiet again. I can't describe the level of fear running through my veins. We called out for Blitz over and over, no response. It was like the forest swallowed him whole. We searched the perimeter for maybe 2 more minutes, but each second felt like an hour. The creature's presence was everywhere, and we knew we were completely outmatched in the dark. Bulldog tossed a makeshift torch, just a rag soaked in fuel, to see if it would buy us a few moments to move. The flames highlighted the trunks of the pines, flickering shadows dancing all around. I was half expecting to see that giant silhouette leap out at us, but nothing happened. We made the tough call to retreat. We scrambled to the vehicle, hearts hammering, scanning our surroundings the entire way. That was when it truly sank in. Blitz was gone. We didn't even know if he was dead or alive. The worst part was the radio still hissed with that static, like it was taunting us. The ride back felt unreal. We radioed in for backup, gave them our location, everything. But that sense of defeat, of having left a teammate behind, was unbearable. The park gates looked exactly the same as when we arrived, just a little chain across a small dirt path. But the whole place felt like it had changed in a matter of hours. We got out of there and handed over all our intel, but to this day, I've never gotten any closure. No sign of Blitz, no real explanation of what roams those woods. It's like Delna Woods Park swallowed him and spat out only fear and confusion for the rest of us. Even now, whenever I think about it, my hands start to shake. I've heard stories of animals or rumored cryptids, but I've never seen anything that big, that aggressive, and that smart. In the official debrief, we gave our testimonies, but the higher-ups only told us they'd investigate further. Since then, nobody's told me a damn thing about the follow-up. It's like the entire thing was swept under the rug. But I know what I saw. There's something out there, and I can't explain it. None of us can. We went in expecting a routine recon, and we left -1 teammate, plus a lifetime of nightmares. That was the only day I ever set foot in Delna Woods Park. It all happened so fast, from the morning briefing to the midnight horror, and then it ended as abruptly as it started. No more activity on the radio, no more snapping branches, just this crushing silence and emptiness when we finally drove off. Part of me still hopes in some crazy way that Blitz made it out somehow. But I can't shake the memory of that single gunshot echoing through the trees. It haunts me. I don't have answers, and I doubt I ever will. All I know is something in those woods defies everything I understand about the world. And if anyone asks, I'll swear on my life, we faced something that night that wasn't meant to be found. Story 15. Back in 2021, I got a sudden order to travel to a small military base near Huxley, Iowa. I'd never even heard of the town before. I flew in on a cold morning, barely had time to drop my bag before I was rushed into a briefing with the local officer. He looked uneasy, like he'd barely slept, and started talking about civilians disappearing on rural trails, strange sightings in cornfields, and search teams that came back with no real answers. I remember feeling a little skeptical at first. People love rumors. But by the end of that briefing, my hands had a slight tremor, and I felt a tight knot in my stomach. The officer's eyes told me he wasn't messing around. I was teamed up with 2 other SEALs I'd worked with before, Foley and Cross. We loaded a discreet pickup with our gear and headed out to the reported hotspots. The roads in that area were mostly dirt, flanked by sprawling cornfields that looked almost endless. The day was overcast, and it was strangely quiet. No birds, barely a breeze. I recall glancing at Foley in the passenger seat, and he looked tense too, jaw clenched like he was bracing for something. Eventually, we parked by a rusted, barbed wire fence that led into a piece of land scattered with old wooden structures. As soon as I set foot on the soft dirt, I noticed prints on the ground. They were elongated, wider than any normal shoe, and definitely not from a person. I bent down to get a closer look. The shape was almost human, but each step was off, like the toes were splayed or something. Foley stood next to me, scanning the tree line. We both shared a glance that said, "What the hell made these?" We decided to follow the prints, leading us deeper along a narrow path that cut through high grass and weeds. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, and the air felt heavy, like before a storm. The track led to a rundown barn or galpone. Hard to call it a barn, really. It was this old, sagging building overtaken by vines and moss on the outside. Broken planks, rusted metal sheets scattered around. It didn't look safe, but we had to check it. Inside, the place smelled like damp wood and something else, an earthy odor that reminded me of stale dirt and sweat. We noticed remnants of what might have been an improvised campsite, a torn sleeping bag, an empty water bottle, and some cigarette butts. But the strangest part were these deep scratches on a wooden beam, spaced so far apart that it would have taken a massive hand or claw to make them. The marks had splinters curling inward, so they were fresh. Cross attempted to radio back to the base to report what we'd found, but the comms were mostly static, just some faint crackling. We tried a couple of channels, same result. At that point, we felt like we were in some weird vacuum, completely cut off. The atmosphere was unsettling, like we weren't alone, even though we could see no one around. The 3 of us decided we needed to spread out just a bit, not too far, to cover more ground but stay within a quick dash of each other. Cross went around the back of the barn while Foley and I climbed these rickety stairs to a small loft. With every step, the floor creaked as if it would collapse. Up there, we found old crates, an ancient tool bench, and something I wasn't expecting, a small setup of wires and what appeared to be some kind of sensor. It wasn't standard farm equipment, that's for sure. Looked more like a surveillance rig, but it was all half broken. I heard a hiss from Foley, who motioned for me to be quiet. Something out of sight was moving below us. Then we both froze because we heard Cross's voice through the staticky radio, whispering that he'd caught a glimpse of something huge outside. That was enough for me. I signaled Foley, and we carefully moved back down. The second we got to the barn's main floor, we saw Cross hustling in from the rear entrance, eyes wide. He just shook his head like he couldn't believe what he'd seen. Suddenly, this low, guttural snarl came from somewhere behind the barn walls. It sounded almost like an animal, but deeper, resonating in my chest. The next moment is kind of a blur. Foley raised his weapon and fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare off whatever it was. But instead of running away, the thing darted in the opposite direction, circling us, silent and incredibly fast. I caught the faintest glimpse through a gap in the wood. Large shape, maybe hunched. I swear I saw two glowing eyes, reflecting like a cat's butt on a much bigger scale. My adrenaline spiked. We were definitely being watched or hunted, and we were out of reliable communication with our base. I didn't want to lose any of my guys, so I ordered us to retreat to the truck. We moved quickly, staying low and keeping each other in sight. Outside, the moon was peeking through the clouds, giving the fields a silver glow. It was eerie, the tall cornstalks rustling in the breeze, but we didn't have time to admire the view. We hurried along a narrow dirt path, boots sinking into the soft ground, hearts pounding. The entire time, I felt this presence pacing us, like it was matching our speed just out of sight in those fields. Sometimes we'd hear a stalk snap or a heavy rustle, but when we shone our flashlights, we saw nothing. Every so often, I'd catch a brief motion at the corner of my eye, a tall figure weaving in and out of the plants. It never attacked, just kept pace, letting us know it was there. Foley was breathing heavily, muttering about how messed up this was, and Cross kept looking over his shoulder every few steps. When we finally got to the truck, I felt a momentary rush of relief. Foley hopped into the driver's seat. I climbed in the passenger side, and Cross took the back. We locked the doors, as if that would really help if this thing decided to charge us. The engine roared to life, and we sped out of there, headlights illuminating rows of corn whipping by on either side. I remember gripping the dashboard so hard my knuckles went white. All the way back to the base, we kept hearing these odd, distant sounds, like faint thumps or something big moving parallel to the road. I couldn't see it, but I knew it wasn't gone. Eventually, the base's lights came into view, and I felt a wave of relief, like we'd outrun whatever was stalking us. Once inside, we all just stood there for a moment, trying to process. Foley and Cross looked as shaken as I was. We were alive, but none of us had an explanation for what the hell we saw, or almost saw. That night, none of us really slept well. I filed a report with every detail I could remember: the footprints, the smell in the barn, the broken surveillance equipment, and especially that creature's eyes in the dark. The officer who'd briefed us looked concerned, but also like he wasn't surprised. Maybe he'd heard something similar from the other search teams. I couldn't tell. But the base didn't have the manpower or the immediate protocol to handle something like this. We were told to stand by for further instructions while they escalated the issue. Nothing else major happened the following night, or at least not that we heard about. But every once in a while, I'd hear whispers from the locals about huge silhouettes moving near the cornfields at dusk. People kept disappearing, though the official statements never tied it to anything out of the ordinary. We left a few days later, only to be replaced by another rotating unit, so I never got the full story of what came next. Even now, I can't fully explain what we encountered that day. All I know is that it felt predatory, and it was definitely big, bigger than any person I've come across. For me, the creepiest part was how it watched us, like it was thinking. It didn't bolt when Foley fired a warning shot. It just adapted, moving around us like we were prey. It still bothers me, and I haven't been able to rationalize it away. Some nights, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I replay those moments in the barn. I see those strange footprints, that flicker of glowing eyes, and I feel my pulse spike like I'm right back there again. To this day, the official line remains vague. There's no conclusive report, no real closure. It happened, and then it just stopped, at least for us. What unsettles me most is not having answers. I've seen a lot in my career, but that experience in Huxley, Iowa, still keeps me looking over my shoulder. I can't shake the feeling that something dangerous is hiding out there, something most people wouldn't believe even if I showed them the footprints myself. And that feeling, it makes my skin crawl every time I remember it.